It is 4:17 a.m. on July 9th, 2025, and a charter Boeing 737 is taxiing onto a private apron at Alexandria International in Louisiana. The air smells like jet fuel and wet asphalt. A line of white buses idles on the tarmac, headlights cutting through the Gulf humidity, and inside each bus, the seats are bolted to the floor, and the windows are tinted so dark that the men behind them are only outlines. No passenger manifest is public. No tail number shows up on flight trackers. Inside the aircraft, 134 men sit shackled at the wrists, the waist, the ankles, and a contractor in a navy polo walks the aisle counting heads with a clicker. The fuel for this flight was paid for out of a budget line that did not exist 11 days earlier. That line is worth $70 billion, and this flight is the first receipt. 11 days before, on the afternoon of July 4th, 2025, President Donald Trump signs what supporters call the One Big Beautiful Bill in the East Room of the White House. The cameras catch the signature, the handshake, the flag pin. What the cameras do not catch is the single largest infusion of money into immigration enforcement in the history of the United States. Roughly $170 billion across all immigration-related provisions, with the core enforcement engine, the part that funds detention, deportation, agents, and technology, at U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security, totaling close to $70.
For ICE alone, the agency's annual operating budget more than triples overnight. Think about that number for a second. $70 billion is more than the entire annual budget of the Department of State. It is larger than the gross domestic product of Latvia. It is more than NASA spends in 2.5 years. And it has been allocated in a single legislative stroke to one mission: removing people from the interior of the country and hardening the border against new arrivals. In a fifth-floor conference room at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, a senior analyst named Muzaffar Chishti spreads the appropriations text across a long oak table on the morning of July 7th. He is 73, soft-spoken, decades into this work. He runs a yellow highlighter down the page and stops at a single line. $45 billion for detention. He underlines it twice. That figure alone, he tells a junior researcher across the table, is 13 times the annual detention budget ICE had the year before. The researcher does the math out loud. At an average cost of $165 per detainee per day, $45 billion buys roughly 116,000 detention beds every day for 5 years. ICE had been holding around 41,000 people on the day the bill passed. The new ceiling, baked into the funding, lands at around 100,000. The largest civilian detention system on Earth, doubled in a single fiscal pivot. But beds are only the first line item.
By July 15th, contracting officers at ICE's Office of Acquisition Management in Potomac Yard, Virginia, begin issuing solicitations under a new expedited authority buried on page 412 of the bill. The authority lets the agency waive standard competition rules for any contract tied to surge capacity. Within 3 weeks, the agency posts requests for proposals on soft-sided detention facilities in 6 states: Texas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Arizona, Mississippi, and Florida. The specs call for facilities of 1,000 to 5,000 beds, operational within 90 days on federal or state land already cleared for use. One of those sites is a former missile testing range outside Marathon, Florida. By August 2nd, satellite imagery from Planet Labs shows fresh gravel access roads and the foundation pads for what will become a 3,000-bed tented facility, a structure local officials begin calling in press conferences a deterrence center. The journalists covering it use a different name. The internal procurement documents use a third. None of those names appears in the bill itself. The money simply flows. A second receipt. The Government Accountability Office, in a letter dated August 14, 2025, addressed to the chairs of the Senate Homeland Security and House Oversight Committees, raises a quiet alarm.
The bill, the GAO writes, contains no requirement that ICE submit quarterly obligation reports, a standard transparency mechanism present in virtually every large appropriation since the post-9/11 era. The agency is required only to provide an annual summary. Annual. For $70 billion. The letter is 2 pages long. It receives no immediate response. The obvious question is why Congress would write a bill this large with so few strings attached. According to 3 Republican staffers who later spoke to reporters on Background, the answer is speed. The bill's architects believed that any meaningful reporting requirement would slow obligation timelines and give future administrations leverage to claw money back. The strings were cut on purpose. That decision echoes through every line that follows. On the deportation side, the bill allocates roughly $14 billion for what the text calls removal operations. That covers charter flights, commercial seat purchases, in-flight medical contractors, ground transportation, and a category called international coordination, the polite phrase for the diplomatic side payments and aid packages negotiated with receiving countries. By the end of August 2025, ICE Air Operations is running an average of 21 removal flights per day, up from 8 the previous summer. By October, that number climbs to 34. The flights go to Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and for the first time in 2 decades at this volume, to nations across West Africa and Central Asia. A Gulfstream chartered out of Mesa, Arizona, lands in Tashkent, Uzbekistan on September 11, 2025, carrying 9 Uzbek nationals and 12 federal officers. The cost of that single flight, according to a contracting record later obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, is $642,000. That is one flight. There are now thousands. In Phoenix, a 44-year-old removal coordinator named Diana Reyes, a 15-year ICE veteran, sits at her desk on the night of September 19th and watches a queue refresh on her monitor. The queue lists pending removals. 2 weeks earlier, it held 14,000 cases. Tonight, it holds 71,000. Her unit was authorized to hire 14 new coordinators. They've managed to bring on 4. She types a message to her supervisor that reads simply, "We cannot move people faster than we can paper them." The reply comes back at 11:42 p.m. Find a way. She does not find a way. Nobody does. The bill funds beds and flights at a pace the bureaucracy was never built to match, and the gap between authorization and execution becomes its own crisis. Detainees sit in county jails in Ohio and Tennessee for 40, 60, 90 days waiting for transfer to facilities that exist on paper and not yet in the desert. Local sheriffs, paid a federal per diem of $98 per detainee, do not complain. The math works for them. In one county in eastern Kentucky, the sheriff's office reports the federal contract has become the single largest line item in the county budget, larger than schools. It works for the contractors, too. By the end of fiscal year 2025, the 2 largest private detention operators, Geo Group and Core Civic, have signed new ICE agreements valued at a combined $4.1 billion. Their stock prices, which had been climbing since November 2024, double again between July and December. A third firm, a logistics company called Akima, quietly secures a $1.2 billion contract for transportation services. None of the three contracts went through full and open competition. The bill is doing exactly what it was written to do. It is moving money into the hands of the institutions ready to receive it. That includes the agencies, the vendors, and the cooperating states. Whether that is the system working correctly or the system failing in a particular direction depends on where you stand on the underlying mission. But the system itself is functioning, and the engineering of it deserves to be understood plainly. This was not an accident. This was a design. Here is the controversial part, and it deserves to be said carefully. The most consequential figures in this story are not the politicians who voted for the bill.
They are the procurement officers, the contracting attorneys, and the budget analysts who knew, weeks before the vote, exactly how the money would flow and exactly which oversight provisions had been stripped from the draft language, and who said nothing because raising the alarm was not in their job description. The bill passed because the technocrats who could have explained it stayed quiet. That silence was bought too, just not on any line item the public will ever read. A third receipt, this one for technology. Inside the $70 billion is roughly $10 billion designated for border infrastructure and operational technology. That category funds 700 new miles of border barrier, but it also funds something quieter and more lasting, the digital perimeter. Contracts go out for autonomous surveillance towers, for fiber optic ground sensors, for license plate readers across a 200-mile interior zone, for biometric exit kiosks at 32 international airports, and for an expansion of the Homeland Advanced Recognition Technology Database, known internally as HART. HART is designed to hold biometric records, fingerprints, facial scans, iris data, DNA markers on up to 270 million people. The expansion funded by the bill brings that capacity online ahead of schedule. Palantir Technologies wins a $480 million extension of its existing ICE case management contract. Anduril Industries secures $250 million for autonomous tower deployment in Arizona and New Mexico. A smaller firm called Paragon Solutions, headquartered in McLean, Virginia, receives a $96 million award for what the contract describes only as mobile device forensic services. None of those contracts trigger a public hearing. The total surveillance allocation is larger than the entire annual budget of the Drug Enforcement Administration. A senior policy analyst at the Cato Institute, David Beer, publishes a breakdown on October 8, 2025, that spreads fast through immigration policy circles. He calculates that the per-arrest cost of the new enforcement architecture lands somewhere between $77,000 and $214,000, depending on how detention time and deportation logistics are counted. The previous decade's average was roughly $14,000. The cost per removal has risen by more than an order of magnitude. The deterrent value, he writes, remains unproven. That is a hard number to absorb. So consider it this way. For the cost of removing a single person under the new framework, the federal government could fund 2 years of community college tuition for 40 students. It could pay for a small-town fire department for a year. It could cover the salaries of 3 Border Patrol agents. The opportunity cost is not theoretical. It is built into every flight that leaves Alexandria. Several courts have tried to intervene. By November 2025, federal judges in California, Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia have issued temporary restraining orders against specific provisions: the expedited contracting waiver, the expansion of expedited removal authority into the interior, the use of certain biometric data without judicial review. Each ruling slows a sliver of the apparatus. None of them slows the money. Once obligated, the appropriation becomes very difficult to undo. The Justice Department's litigation strategy, according to court filings, is straightforward. Appeal everything and let the calendar do the work. The congressional opposition, for its part, largely disappeared. The bill passed the Senate 51-49 and the House 218-214. A handful of Republican senators raised concerns about the deficit impact, and the Congressional Budget Office scored the immigration provisions as adding roughly $1.4 trillion to the federal debt over 10 years, once interest is counted. But those concerns were absorbed by a procedural maneuver that bundled the immigration funding with extensions of the 2017 tax cuts. Voting against the package meant voting against the tax cuts. Almost nobody did. And then there are the people inside the system while the system scales. In a detention facility outside Eloy, Arizona, on the night of December 3, 2025, a 28-year-old asylum seeker from Cameroon named Eric N., his last name redacted in the facility log, files a grievance about chest pain.
The facility, recently expanded from 1,500 beds to 2,800 under the new funding, has a medical staffing ratio that has not kept pace. He is told to wait until morning. He is found unresponsive at 6:12 a.m. He is the 14th in-custody death of fiscal year 2026. The fiscal year is 64 days old. 14 deaths in 64 days. That rate is roughly 4 times the prior 5-year average. The Office of the Inspector General opens a review on December 9th. The projected completion date is late 2027. By then, the obligation cycle for the $70 billion will be more than half complete, and many of the facilities under scrutiny will be functionally permanent. It was a bad design, but it was the design the country chose, and the people who chose it understood the trade-offs before they signed. By the spring of 2026, the architecture has taken visible shape. There are 87,000 people in ICE detention on the morning of April 1, 2026, the highest number in the agency's history. There are 41 new, soft-sided facilities operational across 9 states. There are 11,200 new ICE personnel hired or in the hiring pipeline, including 3,000 deportation officers, 2,500 attorneys, and a category the budget calls mission support that absorbs the rest. The annual removal pace is on track to exceed 600,000, more than double the previous record set in 2013. The border barrier construction, funded at roughly $46 billion across multiple line items when fencing, roads, lighting, and technology are combined, has reached 312 new miles by April. Encounters at the southwest border, which began falling sharply in early 2025, remain near 25-year lows. The administration cites this as proof the strategy is working. Critics cite the same data as proof the deterrent effect came from policy changes that preceded the spending, and that the $70 billion is funding a wartime apparatus for a war that has already largely ended. That argument will be litigated for years. The infrastructure will exist regardless of who wins it. Return now to the tarmac at Alexandria, to July 9, 2025, to the Boeing 737 with 134 men aboard, the contractor with the clicker, the white buses with bolted seats. That flight was, by the bill's own accounting, one of the cheapest deportation flights of the entire fiscal year. The destination was Guatemala City. The flight time was 4 hours and 12 minutes. The per-passenger cost, including ground operations and security, came to approximately $4,300. Multiply that number by the volume the system is now built to sustain, and the 70 billion stops being an abstraction. It becomes a logistics equation with a known throughput and a known cost per unit. It becomes a machine. The machine works. That is what advocates and analysts most struggle to communicate to the public.
The objection is not that the bill failed to fund what it promised. The objection is that it funded exactly what it promised, at a scale the country has never attempted, with oversight mechanisms the country has never accepted for any comparable expenditure. The Pentagon's budget, larger in raw dollars, comes with hundreds of statutory reporting requirements. ICE's new budget comes with almost none. At 4:17 a.m. on July 9, 2025, the 737 lifts off the runway at Alexandria International and banks south over the Gulf. The men inside do not know the cost of their seat. They do not know the name of the bill that paid for it. They know only that the door behind them has closed and that the country they entered, by whatever path and for whatever reason, has now spent more on removing them than it has ever spent on anything else it does to a single human being. The wheels retract. The lights of Louisiana fall away, and somewhere in a fifth-floor conference room in Washington, a 73-year-old analyst caps his yellow highlighter and stares at a number he cannot quite make peace with. $70 billion. Spent. Obligated. Gone. And only the first receipt has cleared.